Walk with me as we take a broad-ranging tour of the world of cannabis, from the ancient to the modern, the medical to the recreational, as well as the social, cultural, and political landscapes of this fascinating plant. I am Dr. Drjakefelice, and this is the Cannabismatrix, where cannabis science meets cannabis culture, where recreational meets medical, and where the body's own endocannabinoid system is as much a player as CBD or THC. Welcome. Hi there, and welcome to the Cannabismatrix podcast. I'm Dr. Drjakefelice, and today I'd like to chat a little bit about cancer and cannabis, specifically anti-cancer properties of cannabis. When I first started practicing cannabinoid medicine, we did not refer to anti-cancer properties of cannabis. We used the term anti-cancer potential. But we have a lot more information now in terms of the peer-reviewed literature. And I think that where the rubber meets the road for patients is how can cannabis benefit them? And a very interesting recent study, the Journal of the American Medical Association came out with a paper showing that cancer patients using cannabis have better quality of life than patients who don't use cannabis. Specifically, cannabis patients experience less anxiety and less pain than patients who have cancer and are not using cannabis. They also have an improved sense of well-being, as well as improved appetite and generally better quality of life. Importantly, and I want to get this out there first, I feel that it is not appropriate for any physicians to be saying that cancer can be cured by cannabis. I think it's still too early for that. But what we can say is that in certain circumstances, in laboratory animals such as breast cancer, we have seen cannabinoids create a cure for cancer. But we still just need so very, very much more information in terms of clinical trials. I will be posting all of the peer-reviewed literature on my website, so if you're listening to this via audio, you can tune in to the and catch those peer-reviewed references at drjakefelice.com. And I'd like to lead in and on my website that I just mentioned, there will be links to a primer for doctors from the National Cancer Institute that is specifically written by clinicians who understand the cannabinoid science for doctors. And I'm also going to include a link there where there's one for patients as well, so that you can have access to some very conservative, medically conservative, peer-reviewed information. What the National Cancer Institute says about cannabis, basically four things. One is that the US FDA, Food and Drug Administration, has not approved cannabis as a treatment for cancer or any other medical condition. But they do say that chemical components of cannabis called cannabinoids activate specific receptors throughout the body to produce pharmacologic effects, particularly in the central nervous system and immune system. So there is an acknowledgement that the receptor system has pharmacologic activity. Also, National Cancer Institute says that commercially available cannabinoids such as dronabinol and nabilone are approved drugs for the treatment of cancer-related side effects. And fourthly, cannabinoids may have benefits in the treatment of cancer-related side effects, so that they make reference to non-approved cannabis as potentially having benefits, and I will link to that for you guys as well. So emerging science is showing promise for cannabis and cancer pain, also neuropathic pain, and many patients have good success with cannabis in working together with their conventional oncology therapies and treatments. Cancer diagnoses are always very serious. And I always recommend that patients follow the treatment recommendations of their oncologist. In fact, if a patient of mine is not in hospice or under the care of an oncologist, I don't treat them for cannabis. And also, while we're on another similar topic, I do not sell or market cannabis products, including hemp-based CBD products. So some cancers in the laboratory, I think we need to make a distinction between human studies and laboratory studies. But the laboratory studies can instruct us to a degree in cancers that do seem to exhibit sensitivity to cannabinoids. Include many different types of brain tumors, glioblastoma, astrocytoma, neuroblastoma, as well as skin cancers, lung, liver, pancreas, breast, and prostate cancers. These days, with conventional oncology, they are utilizing usually multi-targeted effects, multi-targeted treatments rather, to produce the desired effects. The one drug, one target model of 20th century pharmacology has been very successful, but it does have limitations when we are faced with a very complex disease process such as cancer or complex neurodegenerative diseases such as MS or Lou Gehrig's disease. These very complex diseases such as cancer are increasingly related to interactions between multiple biochemical pathways, multiple genes, multiple types of functional proteins. So a comprehensive multi-targeted effect is the current standard of care and the most advanced form of Western medicine that we have. And these diseases, such as cancer, are increasingly being viewed as systemic diseases resulting from interactions between all of these pathways and biological networks, as I like to call them. And the robustness of our biological networks are really what keeps us healthy, specifically their ability to withstand disturbances, whether from outside of the body, in the case of disease vectors, or from inside of the body in the case of cancer. And the recovery of this equilibrium is a promising venue, I think, for clinical research and is a major rationale for full spectrum approaches, whether they be multiply targeted through chemotherapy and conventional means or through botanical therapies. Very importantly, I talked a little bit in the last podcast episode about connective tissue interstitium as kind of the hardwiring of the internet of our body that the endocannabinoid system runs on. The interstitium, which is now considered to be an organ, is the terrain in which all immune responses and tissue repair processes take place. So very important area of the body for focusing cancer study, research, and treatments. And it is in this connective tissue matrix that I think a lot of the causes as well as the solutions to some of our very complex diseases, including cancer, may potentially be found. So what is cancer? The word cancer, if you study astrology, cancer is the crab. And when early physicians encountered the tumors or tumor masses, they noted how very much like there were almost tentacles or claws of certain tumors that would grow into the surrounding tissue. Hence it got the name crab. When a normal healthy body, if I get a cut on my hand, the cells will have been artificially separated, whether it be from a rock or from the ground or a pavement or a scratch. The cells are disrupted and they need to grow back together to heal. So normal cells will undergo a replication process in the healing, but once those cells reach a point where they come back into contact with each other, they stop growing. It's called contact inhibition. Cancer doesn't do that. When cancer cells butt up against other cells or tissues, they don't stop growing. They keep growing. That's one of the mechanisms that cancer tumors form and spread. Another thing that tumors need as they are growing, and remember, for example, in the case of colon cancer, this is why colon cancer screening is so important. It can take 20 years for a cancer tumor to grow from a single cell to the size of a grape. 20 years from a single cell to the size of a grape, but from the size of a grape to the size of a football can take as little as 2 years. So this is the reason why, in the case of colon cancer, I think that colonoscopies are very good screening tools. Back to my point is that as that tumor is growing, it needs to establish its own blood supply. Cancer cells are alive. They come from our body's own cells. So they also, like our body's own cells, the cancer cells need their own blood supply. And as the tumor is growing, they need to grow their own blood vessels. And part of the chemical process that is involved in that is something called angiogenic growth factor. It's a chemical that our body naturally secretes, or the cancer cells will use to grow their own blood vessels so that they become larger. Another feature of cancer that I think a lot of folks understand is metastases. And basically metastases is the spread of cancer from one area of the body to other areas. For example, from the prostate gland to the bones, or to the lungs, or to the brain. This metastases requires the cells to move. And to do that, many of the cancer cells will literally grow cellular feet and walk through the connective tissue or the lymphatics of the body to other areas. It's called diapedesis. Cancer is walking as one of the major ways that cannabis can spread and metastasize. So that was technical explanation, but I think will help us understand some of these anti-cancer mechanisms of cannabinoids, because they plug right into these cellular processes, this pathology of the cancer. So there are, on my list here, 4, depends on how you divide them, major mechanisms that the body uses to protect itself from cancer. One is called apoptosis. That's one way to pronounce it. I hear other people say apoptosis. That's probably what I will refer to, but if you're reading it, there is it looks like apoptosis. And it is important to note that THC is important in fighting apoptosis. CBD is important in fighting apoptosis. And terpene molecules are also important for different reasons, which we'll go into. I want to talk about that specifically. What is apoptosis? It is a programmed cell death where there is literally a cell suicide program. It's a biochemical program that gets initiated, and the cells will self-destruct. If you've ever watched the movie or the TV series Mission Impossible, the messages, once they are read, literally self-destruct. It's built into the program. Our body's cells have self-destruct programs specifically to help protect us against things like cancer. With THC, there's something called the sphingolipid rheostat. And when cancer cells encounter the cannabinoid THC, they start to secrete a chemical, and this chemical is a sphingolipid, or sorry, the chemical is a ceramide. My bad. Normal cells don't produce. When normal cells encounter THC, they don't produce ceramide, but when cancer cells encounter THC, they make ceramide. And what the ceramide does is, cancer is very tricky because it's largely invisible to our immune system. And invisibility is like a superpower, right? Look at Frodo at The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. He put the ring on, he would turn invisible, and nobody could touch him. Our body's cells have a similar thing that happens when they develop cancer. The cancer becomes invisible to the immune system. So these apoptosis programs don't get turned on and the cancer can survive. What THC does is the cancer cells produce ceramide. The immune system can then see that ceramide. It's kind of like maybe throwing a bit of dust on the invisibility cloak, and all of a sudden something goes from being invisible to the immune system to being visible. That's THC. CBD also promotes this cell suicide program, apoptosis, but from a different mechanism. Cancer cells don't really handle calcium normally the way that regular cells do. And part of what CBD does, and that calcium dysregulation or that calcium imbalance also makes it hard for the immune system to do its job. Part of what CBD does is it can restore the calcium homeostasis or the calcium balance in the tumors, in the cancer cells, and that makes them much more easy for the immune system to target, have them turn on that self-destruct program and eliminate them. Terpenes also play a beneficial role. So it makes sense to me if someone is using cannabis for pain, not to just use a single one of these molecules, such as a CBD only or a THC only product, but to rather have the benefit of the combinations or the potential combinations of all of these molecules. So that's apoptosis. A second major mechanism that cannabinoids help with in terms of their anti-cancer properties is prevention of that blood, the blood vessel growth. As the tumor mass is growing, it needs to have its own blood supply. What the cannabinoids do is they turn down something called AGF, angiogenic growth factor, and it makes it much more difficult for the tumor masses to grow their own blood vessels, resulting in slower growth of the tumors. And it's not just what I call the stable cannabinoids, THC and CBD, but also the cannabinoid acids that have some roles to play. We'll discuss more about what a cannabinoid acid is. If you don't know, don't worry about it. But things like CBD acid, CBDA, in human colon cancer cells show a decrease of that cell walking, a decrease of that diapedesis, where the cancer cells will get up and walk around the body and spread to new areas. CBDA in the tissue studies is shown to decrease cell migration through increased prostaglandin production in the cells. So those are the basic mechanisms. I want to just talk about cannabis and cancer in general, and it's important to know that these studies that I'm going to talk about here are not necessarily specific to any particular type of cancer. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, but they're not generalizable to specific cancers. Anyway, there was a really interesting study, and I will again post the link to this, where they looked at patients with very, very aggressive brain cancer, as a glioblastoma multiforme. They had a control group that did not receive any cannabis, and then they had another group that received cannabis. And the type of cannabis, it was a 1-to-1 CBD THC. And I believe they gave about 75 milligrams per day, which is really a lot lower of a dose than what a lot of folks are using. And the folks in the cannabis group that used cannabis with their brain cancer had an 83% survival rate at 1 year. 83% of them 1 year into the study were alive, compared with only 53% in the group for the patients that did not use cannabis. The median survival for the THC CBD group was 550 days, so that's the median survival. If in the group that did not use cannabis was 369 days, so that patients using cannabis lived on, in terms of just the mean number of days, almost a year longer. So we're not talking about cure here, but we are talking about potential benefits. The authors of the study say, quote, the findings from this well-designed controlled study suggest that the addition of a combination of THC and CBD to patients produce relevant improvements in survival compared with placebo, and this is a good signal of potential efficacy. They said, moreover, the cannabinoid medicine was generally well tolerated, which is wonderful because a lot of chemo and radiation are not very well tolerated. But the cannabis was very well tolerated, and they go on to say that these promising results are of particular interest as the pharmacology of THC CBD appears to be distinct from existing oncologic medications and may offer a unique and possibly synergistic options for future glioma treatment. And I will post that study in the blog. A different study, CBD only study. CBD from cannabis plus chemotherapy, not in humans. The prior study was humans, this one is not, but CBD from marijuana plus chemotherapy triples cancer survival in mice. So not in humans, but the mere addition of CBD in the mouse study tripled. The prior study for the glioma, there was a near doubling of survival time. And I want to make sure that I'm not switching to a different study. Okay, this is a different study on CBD, quote, from the authors, and this is from the journal Anticancer Research, quote, CBD is a candidate for treating breast cancer and glioma patients. Authors from Anticancer Research note that several of their patients clearly improved using CBD, including patients with prostate cancer, brain tumors, breast cancer, esophageal cancer, and lymphoma. The authors also presented two what they call impressive cases. One was a 5-year-old kid with a brain tumor, and the other was a 50-year-old with a different type of a brain tumor. And in both cases, remember, these are just small studies, but in both of these cases, the CBD was, the authors said there was a decrease in tumor volume for which CBD was made responsible. They go on to say that we need more studies and that we really can't just draw conclusions from this one single study. Different study. One of the more aggressive types of cancer is a melanoma. It starts as a skin cancer, and this is a just published study of melanoma human cancer cells, not humans, but the human cancer cells. Cannabis extract significantly impeded the process required for metastases. So remember that, moving from one area, the cancer cells, to another. Metastases is the main cause of death in patients with melanoma, and cannabis medicines, according to the authors, are effective adjunctive drugs in cancer patients. What happened biochemically is there are proteins called tau and stathmin proteins. They're key proteins in cancer metastases, and this cannabis with THC decreased the gene expression of those proteins, and we also saw a decrease in cancer metastases. I don't want to go into too much detail because we're being very technical here, folks. Thank you for listening. But this comes from the textbook of Integrative Oncology by Dan Abrams, MD. And we are not seeing interactions with botanicals from cannabis and conventional chemotherapy medications, anti-cancer drugs. Now, they have not looked at all of the anti-cancer drugs because there are so many and new ones coming down the pike frequently, but the major ones have been looked at, and we're not seeing any pharmacokinetic interactions. So obviously we need to keep an eye on that, but it's the data that we have. Now, here's another study. It's a CBD study on pancreatic cancer treatments. Pancreatic cancer can be very deadly and quick, unfortunately. This comes from the journal Oncogene, and they carried out experiments both in cells and in mice. And these mice had been genetically modified to develop pancreatic cancer. And what was found is that the CBD blocks a receptor produced by the GPR55 gene and prevents these cells from interacting with other substances that promote growth and multiplication of cancer cells. What's more, and I'm going to just read directly from this, they found CBD hinders the development of resistance to the chemotherapy drug. So not only was the CBD showing some effectiveness, but typically chemotherapy drugs can be very effective, but if used for a long period of time, they lose their effectiveness. The CBD in this particular case helped prevent that development of resistance to the chemotherapy medications. So a lot of information. I'll post all this on the website, as I mentioned, I think 23 times already. Now, I've done a little bit of research on specific cancer types just to show how little information for some of these things there are, but I just wanted to get these out there. I'm going to just talk about prostate cancer. And to date, there are various in vitro and human cell tissue studies elucidating the potential mechanism of actions for cannabis and cannabinoids for prostate cancer, but we don't have any human studies. No human studies yet. Let's do some human studies. I'm sure there are several underway right now. So as I mentioned, no clinical trials on humans have been conducted for prostate cancer patients. And this is important because until we really have good human studies, we can't be making specific claims. Now, in terms of cancers of the urologic cancers, the highest focus of anti-cancer mechanisms and cannabinoids has been on prostate cancer. There are different mechanisms that have been explored. One area in potential effects against prostate cancer, as I mentioned before, are the development of those apoptosis signals, where it is believed that endocannabinoids could halt the growth of cancer cells. I reference a study for this, and the authors show that treatment with endocannabinoids, which are cannabinoids that our bodies make naturally, produces a dose-dependent slowing of cell growth on all of the different prostate cancer culture cells. So it's not, in this particular one, this was a THC-oriented study looking at, and it was a dose-dependent. Based on these results, the authors suggest that endocannabinoids may be a beneficial option for the treatment of prostate cancer cells that have become non-responsive to common therapies. So they're not saying let's use it as a standalone, but if there seems to be something that's not responding, hey, maybe we can take a look at this. A different study here, which I'll post again, shows the anti-cancer activity of cannabinoids is also linked to what we call the induction of phosphatases. And in this particular study shows that cannabinoids induce genetic expression of several phosphatases in prostate cancer cells, And this is a very common pathway that anti-cancer drugs work on. So it's working on, in this particular case, a similar mechanism to some of the other anti-cancer drugs. I'm just going to go through a few more studies and we'll be done. Journal of Immunotoxicology suggests that CB2 agonists can offer a new approach to prostate cancer treatment by decreasing epithelial cell proliferation, so decreasing the spread there. And a different study here also showing a 1999 study that THC can actually induce apoptosis in prostate cancer cell lines. And very interestingly, these effects occurred independently of cannabinoid receptors. So this was a THC study, but it was working through a non-classically understood mechanism. Normally, we think of THC as working through cannabinoid receptors, CB1, CB2. This occurred through a different mechanism. I think that's fascinating. Different study from the British Journal of Pharmacology. Non-THC cannabinoids, such as CBD, inhibit prostate cancer growth via pro-apoptosis effects, again through starting that cell suicide program that we talked about earlier in the video. Anti-Cancer Research, November of 2011, features an article on CBD and a synthetic cannabinoid that mimics THC, so a combination. And they were able to produce this apoptosis, cell suicide in prostate cancer, colon cancer cells through phosphate-dependent signaling pathways. One more study. The anti-proliferative and anti-apoptotic effects of anandamide. Again, this is talking about ceramide production. So, thanks for listening if you made it that far. That was a lot of really technical information, but I don't see this technical information being presented very much in the literature that most folks are reading. Usually it's how to do this with cannabis, and this is more of about why cannabis might be a potentially good option. For folks with cancer, clinically, the improved quality of life can be a very big and important feature in the clinical decision-making process. Also remember that cannabis can be good for symptom control, whether that be for pain, for nausea, vomiting. If you get a little sunburn, not a sunburn, but radiation burn from radiation treatments, can be very effective for treating the symptoms. And the why of the anti-cancer properties just comes into play, meaning, well, maybe I have cancer with pain. I can take the cannabinoids for my pain. There may be some potential other benefits as well. Also, the disease modification or the symptom relief is occurring generally at a very low risk for toxicity, and also the cannabinoid therapies tend to be very well tolerated. So that's it. I would be happy to do another episode specifically on using cannabinoids for cancer pain or nausea, vomiting, how to use them. But I wanted to really just talk about the why of what's happening and also give you guys a survey of the literature, which I think is starting to be substantive and growing every day. Please, if you like this video, click like, subscribe to my channel, let your friends know about this. I think it's important work. And until the next time, I'm Dr. Jakefelice at the Cannabismatrix podcast. Thank you for listening.
Well, it was in my childhood days, oh Lord, many long years ago. Now with the Spirit, now of my Savior, I was filled, Lord, filled